Anyone searching within the Old Testament for a Hebrew national epic is at least initially applying an entirely extraneous category to this collection of religious writings. For most of its history, the Bible has been regarded as a divine revelation imparted to Judaism and thus to Christianity through the media of Moses and the prophets. This religious aura has gradually faded only in the course of modernity. The notion of Moses' authorship of the Torah, however, persisted for a long time, and the literary material continued to be interpreted in the light of this premise. I'll skip the beginnings and jump to the middle of the 18th century. At that time, things began to change under the influence of the Enlightenment. In 1753, Jean Astruc made this guy made the fundamental discovery that continues to inform modern literary criticism of the Bible, that the book of Genesis is composed from multiple literary sources. Nonetheless, Astruc did not abandon the Mosaic origin. His hypothesis even served to defend it because it could explain the inconsistency of the biblical account by pointing to the plurality of sources, thus weakening one of the critics' main arguments. However, Moses had to change roles. He went from author to editor, as one would say today. In the same year, 1753, the lectures De Sacra Poesie Hebræorum by Robert Loth were published at Oxford, which were to become the basics of aesthetic and genre-critical studies of the Bible. In 1787, Johann Gottfried Eichhorn, an Old Testament scholar at Jena and later at Göttingen, divined that with the work De Sacra Poesie Hebræorum, posterity will one day begin the history of a better and more correct interpretation of the Hebrew poets and prophets. The crucial innovation was Loth's comparative approach, to use the modern term. Eichhorn again summed the matter up succinctly. He compared the legacies of Greek and Roman poetry with Hebrew poetry in order to bring to light what was distinctive and peculiar about the latter. Before the middle of the 19th century, only Greek and Roman poetry was available for such a comparison. In its execution, Loth remained biased in favor of the Bible. In his view, poetry was originally motivated by religion. It was a gift from God. This religious poetry attained its primary form, primary in both a developmental and a qualitative sense, among the Hebrews. To him, the Psalms and Job preceded Homer and Horace and remained superior to them. Loth has had a great impact also in the German-speaking world, not least because in 1758, Johann David Michaelis, the most prominent biblical scholar of his time, published the Praelectiones de Sacra Poesie Hebræorum also at Göttingen. Aesthetic studies of the Old Testament became far more popular as a result, and one can also observe the beginnings of genre criticism. Loth had already distinguished the forms of Hebrew poetry and made a start at describing prophetic poetry, nebuah, lament, kina, teaching, saying, ashal, and ode, sheer. Lowth further considered Job to be the oldest of all biblical books. And while time has caused such attempts at dating and the notion of the Bible's divine origin to be revised, Lowth has remained important for establishing the field of literary biblical studies in the narrow sense. His impact was felt even as far as the Baltic states. After studying theology at Königsberg, Johann Gottfried Herder, who was to become a pivotal figure of German classicism in Weimar from 1776, was a teacher at the cathedral school and assistant to the parish priest in Riga from 1764 to 69. Inspired by Lowth, here is the memorial still of Herder in Riga. Inspired by Lowth, he planned in 1766 to 67 to write his own De Sacra Poesie, though it did not appear until 1782 and 83 under the title Vom Geist der hebräischen Poesie, on the spirit of Hebrew poetry, in 2 volumes. Instead, he wrote a manuscript über die ersten Urkunden des menschlichen Geschlechts, einige Anmerkungen, on the first documents of the human race, some notes, in which he explained the first chapters of the Bible. He presented this manuscript to his friend and publisher Johann Friedrich Hartknoch in Riga, who published the works of Kant, among other things, but did not hand it over to the publisher, but instead took it with him when he left the Baltic for good in 1769. It was not until 1774 to 76 that he published a heavily modified version in 2 volumes, now entitled Älteste Urkunde des Menschengeschlechts, the oldest document of the human race. The earlier version was not rediscovered until 1980. The version that Herder wrote in Riga had a broad cultural historical horizon from the outset. As the title already shows, it no longer focused on the Hebrews, as Lowth had done, but set its sights on the human race in general, whose first documents, the sources of the biblical primeval history, were now considered to be. Herder saw Genesis 1 to 11 not as a unified whole, but as a compilation of several documents, each of which had its own distinct point of origin. This distinction is unquestionably correct when comparing the creation narrative in Genesis 1 with the narrative of the fall of man in Genesis 3, with the flood narrative in Genesis 6 to 9, with the table of nations in Genesis 10, and the narrative of the building of the tower in Genesis 11. It shows that Herder adequately understood the nature of the narratives. Herder, like a Strick before him, did justice to the literary facts as we see them today. Herder later famously summarized the most important premise of his interpretation by saying, "The Bible must be read with human eyes, for it is a book written by humans for humans. The language is human. The external tools with which it is written and preserved are human. And finally, the sense with which it can be grasped, every aid that elucidates it, as well as the entire purpose and use to which it is to be put, are human. You may therefore safely believe that the more humanly, in the best sense of the word, you read the word of God, the closer you will come to the purpose of its creator, who created men in his image and in all works and blessings where he shows himself to us as God acts humanly for us." This demand comes with a confession. Despite the humanity of the Bible, Herder affirms God as its author. Only the divine is now made to act through the human. The contradiction this seems to contain is paralleled by another one. Although, as the title says, the oldest documents originate from the human race as a whole, they are at the same time national documents of the Hebrew people. I have sleuthed out the way of thinking of the nations, and what I have worked out without system or pondering is that each of them created documents according to the religion of its country, the tradition of its fathers, and the concepts of the nation. That these documents appeared in a poetic language, in poetic dressings and poetic rhythms. They were thus mythological national songs of the origins of their oldest idiosyncrasies. And every nation of antiquity had such songs. For Herder, the emergence of national epics is an anthropological universal, and such epics are poetry as a rule. The best proof of this for Genesis is in this first chapter, which Herder also calls the oldest piece of tradition in the ancient world, the most venerable antiquity of the Orient. The schematic sequence of the creational account, which is repetitions of the command to create and its exact execution, allowed him to recognize a song in it, according to the custom of all national myth of that time. Creation was clothed in, as it were, in an epic poem. With a little force, the first creation account of the Bible can indeed be read as poetry. Even the modern translations render this text as rhythmic prose. At this point, however, Herder has to qualify this claim. I will not say that all are equally poetic, all complete poetries and songs. Only some we shall get to know as such. The others, however, are remnants, pieces of the poetic tradition with poetic spirit in all of them. The notion of poetry having priority over prose has always existed. It was already familiar to the Greeks, Homer before Herodotus and Thucydides. It still has its adherents today. With regard to the Bible, the most far-reaching theory was put forward by the German philologist and linguist Eduard Sievers in his Metrische Studien, Metrical Studies, published from 1901 onwards in the publications of the Saxonian Academy of Science. In volume 1, he initially considered only the Lamech song in Genesis 4, Noah's curse and blessing of his sons in Genesis 9, Isaac's blessings of Jacob and Esau in Genesis 27, and Jacob's blessing at Genesis 49 to be poetic sections, mostly in triple rhythm. In the second volume, published in 1905, however, he interpreted the whole of Genesis metrically. I quote, "After I thought I had recognized that it too was written entirely in verse." On Sievers' interpretation, the first book of the Bible actually becomes a kind of Homeric epic with a septuple meter as the norm. This transformation could not be effected without a plethora of arbitrary textual changes. The change of the alleged meter was even used to distinguish between different sources of the present text. Sievers' proposal impressed Hermann Gunkel, and Otto Proksch used the septuple pattern for his Genesis commentary. Later scholars rightly refrained from such attempts. But let us return to Herder. Even though he treated Genesis as a national epic, among others, in his own way, he also maintained its cultural historical primacy and universal validity. Ever since John Spencer, De Legibus Hebraeorum Ritualibus in Cambridge, 1685, the obvious assumption has been widespread that Moses introduced a great number of Egyptian ideas into the biblical tradition. After all, the Bible tells us that he was the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter and was hence under the influence of Egyptian culture. This idea was incompatible with the priority of the Hebrew national epic. To avoid the problem, Herder argued that the oldest documents did not derive from Moses, but had existed already before his time. As in Astrück, Moses is understood as a collector and editor. These pre-Mosaic documents allow the Bible to maintain its key position in what one might call revelation in terms of theology. Even read in human terms, the Bible can thus preserve its divine origin, and on this premise, it becomes the nucleus from which cultural history in general could grow forth. This argument, deriving the cultural history of humankind from a single epic, was later picked up again from the opposite perspective, namely in the hypothesis put forward by the Marburg Assyriologist Peter Jensen, das Gilgamesch-Epos in der Weltliteratur, the Gilgamesh epic in world literature, Strasbourg, 1906. He now argued that the key position in the development of literary world culture was due not to the Bible, but to the epic of Gilgamesh, and wanted to derive virtually all early literature from this epic. It, of course, has been a spleen, we would say today, but nevertheless, he was a very good Assyriologist. And I was taught that Walter Baumgartner went to Marburg to learn Akkadian from Jensen. But the best refutation of this over-enthusiastic comparative approach was put forward by Walter Anderson in Tartu über Peter Jensens Methode der vergleichenden Sagenforschung, about Peter Jensen's method of comparative sacred research, Acta et Commentationes Universitatis Tartuensis, 21-3, 1930. The thesis of the Hebrew national epic made its return in Martin Leberecht de Wette's Kritik der Bücher Mose als Quelle der Geschichte, Kritik of the Books of Moses as the Source of History, Halle 1807, where it was no longer encumbered by dogma and made methodological sense. De Wette had experienced Herder as a pupil at school in Weimar, but his approach was different, that of a historian, and he took an approach along the lines of genre criticism. His premise, his other the result is, I quote, that I take the whole Pentateuch from beginning to end to have mythical meaning. That is to say, it is not a historical account and does not want to be. It is the product of patriotic religious poetry of the Israeli people, in which their spirit, their way of thinking, their patriotism, their philosophy, and their religion are reflected, but not the actual course of their history. The Pentateuch is therefore useless as a source of history. This is the title of this book, Kritik der israelischen Geschichte. I call the whole we are trying to produce an epic. To be sure, it is a Hebrew one, which cannot stand up to the standard of Greek rules of art, but it is excellent and beautiful in its way. I call it an epic because it is a poem, not history, and one worked out according to a certain kind of standard. It is a genuine Hebrew national epic of true national interest, entirely in the spirit of Hebraism. It is the epic of the Hebrew theocracy. De Wette was able to presuppose the unity of the epic because he developed a hypothesis to explain the origins of the Pentateuch, which was later to be called the supplementary hypothesis. What his predecessors, above all Johann Gottfried Eichhorn and Karl David Ilgen, had achieved in terms of analytical insights, namely that the narrative of the Pentateuch had been composed of two or more documents running in parallel, De Wette modified in a key way. In his view, there had been a single continuous basic writing, Schrift, which had provided an outline into which supplementary material had been inserted, a view that once again enjoys a certain popularity in research today. Through Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, there runs an original whole, a kind of epic poem, which earlier than almost all the other pieces, and of these, as it were the original, served as a basis for the collection of documents on this part of history, to which the others are added as explanations and supplements. This is what we must seek to establish and characterize. Framed in the terms we use today, De Wette saw the priestly writing as the Hebrew national epic. Understandably, however, this view had not stood up to scrutiny. On the one hand, this is due to the nature of the content of the priestly writing, which is dominated by the specifically religious to such an extent that it is hardly compatible with a national epic. The source also, for the most part, lacks the kind of narrative material an epic can hardly do without. The other problem is that the literary cohesion of this source ends with Genesis 17 and only resurfaces in the book of Exodus. The priestly writing does hence not suit as the basic writing of the Pentateuch, although it was considered as such by most exegetes until Wellhausen and even again today. In 1853, this led Hermann Hupfeld to reactivate Ilgen's documentary hypothesis in a modified form. He is the father of modern criticism of the Pentateuch in this sense, Yahwist, Elohist, and Grundschrift. And he was soon followed by Theodor Neldeke. And after those famous three persons, Karl Heinrich Graf, Abraham Kühnen, and Julius Wellhausen, were able to prove that what had been considered the basic writing was in fact the younger source of the Pentateuch, which is the basis of the dating we use today. The quality of the oldest source passed to the Yahwist, the from now on oldest document. Consequently, the designation Hebrew national epic was also transferred to the Yahwist, for example, by Eduard Reuss of Strasbourg in 1881. Now, this brings me to the Yahwist, my personal subject of research. First, a word about its nature as a literary work. Under the influence of German Romanticism in particular, from the second half of the 19th century or to the middle of the 20th, this literary work was understood primarily as a comprehensive narrative that reproduced the older, primarily oral folk tradition and was outlined by a unifying literary conception. Today, this view is held only by a minority, most insistently by the Canadian John Van Zetes, who understands the Yahwist as the Hebrew Herodotus and vehemently rejects the idea of an editor. German language research, on the other hand, affirms the view already found in Astruc and Herder that the older source of the Pentateuch is based on pre-existing written sources. The emergence of redactional history in the 20th century was decisive here. It first proved its usefulness on the Gospels of the New Testament, later also on the historical books of the Old Testament, and since the 1960s has turned to the prophetic books and increasingly also to the Pentateuch. In the case of the Yahwistic work, we can now quite accurately distinguish the literary sources from the text of the editor, who combined the sources into the extant complete work, and we are also able to distinguish these two literary levels from the elements that were added even later and that now make up most of the present text. I have not hesitated to call this work the Israelite national epic, though one must, of course, hasten to add that it's in equal measure the origin story of Judaism. Such a definition presupposes, however, that we clarify the social milieu in which the work has come into being, as well as the audience it was conceived for. Defining this work as a national epic presupposes a nation, in this case, a population that has developed a conscious sense of belonging together and a shared history under the name of Israel. The Bible presupposes this common identity from the outset and explains it by pointing to common descent. It need not be said that the genealogy, as it is given in the Bible, does not offer historical sufficient explanation. It is demonstrably late and thoroughly artificial. In view of the rugged and varied nature of the country and the differences in the living conditions of the settled areas, the unity of Israel is not a matter of course, but requires explanation, especially since the neighboring regions are not at all culturally distinct, as we can learn from archaeology. In the sources with useful historical information, occurrences of the name Israel are connected with the kingship. Israel is the territory of population controlled by the kings of Israel. The kings who ruled in the northern part of the southern Levantine hill country from the 10th century to the last third of the 8th century are consistently described as kings of Israel. When the kingship came to an end, so did Israel. On the eve of the Assyrian conquest, the Judean prophet Amos proclaimed Yahweh's threat to Israel: "The end has come for my people, Israel." We can deduce that this unification of the population into one entity with the name Israel and a unified identity was a result of the monarchy. Vice versa, this applies also to the neighboring kingdom of Judah in the south, which continued Israel's sedition after its end and itself claimed to be Israel. This is important for the issue at hand because the Yahwistic word is part of the Judean tradition. The compilation itself and its editing even presuppose the end of the southern kingship, as can easily be shown. The sources used, however, date to the regnal period, that is the 7th century, and as far as they go back to the Israel tradition, even to the 8th century and before. The growing interest in redaction history also led scholars to take a closer look at the pre-editorial material. Increasingly, attention was drawn to the fact that the narrative of the Pentateuch is based on 6 large narrative compositions, each of which was originally handed down as a separate written unit. The primeval history, the patriarchal narratives, the Joseph story, the Moses narratives, the narratives of the Israel journey through the desert, and the narrative of Balaam. Each of these narrative compositions had already undergone a longer history of development because before they were linked together by a redactor, nor have they been preserved intact. Some of them, such as the stories of Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, and Moses, show that they were taken out of a no lost context to be fitted into the extant population. This is only an overview of the patriarchal narratives to show the differences of the material. The nucleus is Genesis 24, 27, 29, 30, and they are connected later and added by more later material. But this also is still basic in the Yahwistic source. Each of these narrative compositions had already undergone a longer history, literary development before they were linked together by the editor. Nor have they been preserved intact, some of them that I read already. The criterion for their selection is easy to determine. In all significant scenes, the protagonists live outside the territory of the kings of Israel and Judah. This is clearly the case for the narrative of Joseph in Egypt and for the Moses narratives, which are set in a foreign land. But also the stories of Isaac take place in Gerar in the land of the Philistines, and Jacob's tale largely focuses on him fleeing abroad from his brother. Abraham was called away from his country on the house of his father and has been living among the Canaanites ever since. And even the starting point of the work is the expansion of humankind from paradise and the subsequent expulsion of the next generation from the cultivated land in Genesis 4. The Earth's horizon is the whole world, as is shown not only by the flood narrative, which is taken from Mesopotamian tradition, but also by the so-called Table of Nations in Genesis 10, and the story on the building of the tower in Genesis 11. The failure of the tower leads to mankind being scattered across the whole earth. The work finally ends with the exodus from Egypt and the return to the promised land, though this aim has not been realized when Moses dies. All this makes clear that the collector and author is addressing the early Jewish diaspora. The conquest of Jerusalem by the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and the end of Judean kingship in the first third of the 6th century have already occurred. Nevertheless, the royal focus is dominant almost everywhere, due to the fact that at that time literary culture was only possible at the royal court or at the temples belonging to it. This observation has led me to consider whether the work could have been written in the environs of the Judean king Jehoiachin, who was deported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar in 597, a fact that is attested with certainty also in Babylonian sources. The royal focus is evident in many details. It is true that important characters are portrayed as shepherds who, for various reasons, have to live in an alien environment. Nevertheless, they play royal roles. This begins in paradise when man is assigned the task of cultivating and guarding the earth, and continues with the invention of cultural techniques, such as the building of cities and weaponry. The hero of the flood narrative, which immediately follows the creation, is thought of as a king in the Mesopotamian versions, and this is indirectly true of in the Bible. When Abraham is commanded by God, Yahweh, to move to a foreign land, he is promised that he will become a blessing for all tribes of the earth. Elsewhere, such promises belong to the ritual of royal investiture. The king is destined by the deity to become a blessing for the land, for example, Psalm 72 and others. Great weight is further given to genealogies. Today they figure as the lineage of God's people, but the fact that history is thought of in terms of genealogy is a legacy of kingship and its dynastic principles. And even that the patriarchs are being buried is also a royal feature, and the dating of the sequence of the generations is a royal feature. This also includes the motive of rivalry between brothers, which is frequent in Genesis. Cain and Abel, Ishmael and Isaac, Esau and Jacob. It reflects the throne disputes that were hardly uncommon in dynasties. Both with Ishmael and Isaac and with Esau and Jacob, the mothers, Sarah and Rebekah, tips the scales. This motive is common in court tradition, where the queen mother decides disputes over the succession, or at least is presented to do it. In Judah, the queen mother bore the title of Gebirah. This is exactly the title given to Sarah in Genesis 16 in her exchange with Hagar. Jacob also occupies a royal room and he founds a sanctuary at Bethel, the royal sanctuary of Israel. In this narrative, the deity appears to the hero in a dream, a situation that is obviously common for kings and occurs for Abimelech in Genesis 20, for Pharaoh in Genesis 41, for Solomon in 1 Kings 3, for Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, outside the Bible, for Gudea of Lagash, for Sargon, for King Kiltu in the Ugaritic Kirku epic. The wrestling match that Jacob wins against an unknown person at the river Jabbok is also a royal motive, for which there are parallels in the Gilgamesh epic and elsewhere, as I learned by Urmas. Finally, Joseph is also portrayed in a royal role when he is cast as the second man after the Pharaoh and as the nurturer of Egypt. Moses is no different, though his birth legend introduces him as a Levite and thus as a prominent priest. It is itself modeled on the birth legend of Sargon of Assur, known from the Neo-Assyrian period and thus on royal material. These observations have so far pertained mainly to pre-editorial sources, about which Urmas Mermik will have more to say with far greater precision. They are not set in a pastoral milieu, as has usually been thought, but draw upon oral tradition. However, this also applies to the editorial level, that is, to the editor who selected the literary fragments and arranged them in the order they are now to be read. This is most evident in the edit dialogues, which are intended to interpret the events and usually also designed to relate them to the God Yahweh for the first time. Kind of linguistic fossil that we may use as a guide is the phrase finding favor in someone's ace, matzache in the Ine. It can be traced back to the Yahwehs no less than 15 times. The phrase has its roots in the style of speech affected at court. It concerns the relationship of someone higher up, usually the king, to someone lower down. In the dialogues, the person of lower rank addresses the higher ranking person as my lord, and calls himself your servant. The courtly milieu is also evident from the for the editor's familiarity with the forms of speech used in the administration of justice. He prominently uses the indictment formula, "What have you done?" He also knows the death penalty law, which was usually issued by the king. On the day that you eat of the tree of knowledge, you shall surely die. He uses the formal accusation, "Why have you done evil?" and the appeal, "Yahweh, judge between me and you." He frequently uses the legal device of appealing to the public by loud cries in order to frame key scenes, such as after the fratricide, where he has the earth raise the cry in Genesis 4, verse 10, and before the destruction of Sodom. The editor further makes use of the language of royal cult and its genres. He employs phrases taken from the individual lament and their counterparts in the Song of Thanksgiving. Yahweh has heard your affliction, Yahweh has seen my misery, I have seen the affliction of my people. As well as the elements of the oracle of salvation that responds to the lament. The assurance formula, "Fear not," the formula of assistance, "I'm with you," and the self-presentation formula, "I am Yahweh." The interplay of these formulas is attested in an Assyrian context in the prophetic salvation oracles to Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. The relation to Jacob at Bethel is shaped by the editor as a cultic encounter with God. And behold, Yahweh stood above it, the ladder, and said, "I am Yahweh," the self-presentation formula, "the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac." And behold, in Septuagint it is added also the formulas, the reassurance formula, "Fear not," and the Hebrew text runs, "I said, I'm Yahweh, behold, I'm with you." This is the formula of assistance, "and will keep you wherever you go, will bring you again into this land." Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Truly, Yahweh is in this place, and I did not know it." The same applies to Moses' encounter with God on Mount Sinai, and Yahweh descended in a cloud and stood here with him, and he called the name of Yahweh. Remarkable features, total features, are the many questions: who, what, why, and above all, where. Where are you, Adam? And where is your brother Abel are the most famous examples of a stylistic device that is singularly frequent here compared with the whole of the Bible. This shows a certain proximity to wisdom, and it is taught at court. So these are the questions of the teacher. The editor refined the scenes into maximes designed to help the reader apply what is being said to his or her own situation. The maximes underline the effective presence of Yahweh. Many have an ethical, and it is not good that mentioned is the first example, and many others follow. I will bless, so that you will be a blessing. Is anything too hard for Yahweh? And so on. A particularly effective communicative device is the pattern of announcement and fulfillment. Incidents are not simply presented as such. Instead, important events are regularly preceded by a promise. The work does this to inspire hope to its addressees. Negative events such as the flood and the destruction of Sodom are likewise announced beforehand. After all, a threat to an enemy equates to a promise of protection for the Israelites. The work traces the development of the people of Israel from the creation of the world to the verge of the conquest of Palestine. From beginning to end, it tells a history of foreigners. This begins obviously with the expulsion from paradise. Having to forge a path to foreign lands is a terrible fate because it violates the basic anthropological fact, the essential connectedness of man, Hebrew Adam, to the earth, Hebrew Adamah. To make this clear, the creation account is edited and expanded. Man is created from the earth, not from clay, as would be possible, and will return to it after the end of his life. The trees of the gardens, as well as the animals, come from the earth, as does woman, albeit indirectly, since she is built from the rib of the man. Man's task in existence is to cultivate the earth from which he was taken. It is a curse for the relationship between man and earth to be disturbed. This is illustrated by the inserted scene of the fall of man in Genesis 3. The central act of disobedience is tragic rather than culpable. The woman was not yet created when Yahweh issued the prohibition, does not know that she is transgressing the prohibition. The serpent's tempting was inserted by a later editor only. And the man does not know the origin of the fruit the woman gives him. Nevertheless, the deed leads to the loss of the original home. Cain suffers worse still because he has watered the earth with his brother's blood. He himself is cursed to leave the cultivated land. Restless and cursory, he wanders the earth. But being a stranger can also be due to a mission from God, as with Abraham. As an act of obedience, his journey into a foreign land is undertaken with assistance and blessing of Yahweh, and finally with the promise of return. It is now clear that the Yahwistic work addresses the Judeans in exile and diaspora and responds to the religious challenge that arose from this situation. The conditions of existence of the stranger in a strange land are depicted acutely and sometimes drastically. Lot experiences the inhabitants of Sodom as a licentious and sacrilegious horde that is not afraid to commit sexual offenses against the guests he has taken into his house. Isaac must fear being murdered by the Philistines for the sake of his desirable and beautiful wife. Joseph is imprisoned on the false accusation of his Egyptian master's wife. Pharaoh presses the Israelites into drudgery in Egypt with the declared aim of decimating them. When this fails, he orders the midwives to kill the newborn sons of the Hebrews. These circumstances caused particularly, you see, this is or it's related to the situation of the exile. These circumstances cause particular ways of life and certain values to develop. Separation from the native population was strictly maintained. This is 24. Internal disputes are settled with reference to special sense of togetherness, so in Genesis 13. Great importance is attached to the succession of generations. To mark its significance, the natural sequence of marriage, conception, and birth is disturbed with unnatural regularity. Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel are all initially barren until Yahweh's intervention causes an heir to be born. The pregnancy of Eve, Hagar, and Leah are also attributed to Yahweh. In this way, even the simple fact of the family continuing becomes proof of Yahweh's powerful assistance. Religion, too, is determined by the conditions of the family. The redaction presupposes that its readers still consider Yahweh's sphere of influence to be bound to the land of Israel and Judah. Yahweh, however, has shed his earlier ties to the land of Israel and Judah and has become a God who goes with his followers. The relationship with him is no longer determined by his worshippers settling where this god has his traditional sphere of activity, but by the clan worshipping Yahweh. Yahweh becomes the god of the fathers, whose decisive characteristic is not the firm attachment to a place, but a permanent relationship to a group of people. From now on, he demonstrates his beneficial power wherever his followers may go. As the God of heaven, he is the creator of the world and guides everyone's fortune. We can here observe a profound change in the history of religion in process. But even as the God of heaven, Yahweh remains attached to his origins. The special relationship with his worshippers persists and indeed becomes the text's true subject. This finally allows us to grasp the historical occasion that led to the creation of this epic, the end of the monarchy and the beginning of Jewish life in the diaspora. The role play of the kings of Judah was preserved by every individual Jew, now adopting the task of kingship into his or her self-understanding. This applies not only to the oldest source of the Pentateuch, but it runs closely to most of the Old Testament. It explains the close connection between religion and ethics that has come to be the hallmark of Judaism as well as Christianity. It also explains the individualization of religion, specifically the compulsion to make personal decision for God. One can see in this a cultural historical push towards modernity that still determines us in the present, even without us being aware of these connections. Jewish and Christian religions have become a factor in the cultural history of mankind to such an extent, not merely due to historical coincidence, but may deprive certain cultures of any lasting impact by granting it to others. No, their impact is due also to their very nature and essence. In view of the challenges facing us today, the royal responsibility for the state of the world, which is incumbent upon all of us, is more relevant than ever. So far, and I thank you for your attention.